Okay, in this video, we're going to finish up our discussion of the financial system. And this video specifically looks at where interest rates come from. And interest rates come from the supply and demand model, or the market for loanable funds. So in here, we're going to be thinking about how does supply and demand for loanable funds for people to borrow or save money affect the interest rate. So that's the price of borrowing. So we're in the market for loanable funds. Let me zoom in for you. Okay, so here we have to be thinking about who would be, so interest rates come from just like anywhere else. They're not set anywhere. It comes from a market. It's set by equilibrium supply and demand. So in the market for loanable funds, we need to be thinking about who would be suppliers and who would be demanders for loanable funds. So here, if we look at, we'll look at supply first. So who supplies money for funds to be loaned out? Well, that's going to be the savers. Savers are lending money or saving money. So in this case, they're supplying money for the market, so demanders in return can borrow money. Okay, so in this case, the supply comes from savings. And we're thinking about this as mostly households are going to be saving. Okay, or in this model, the government is also part of public savings, and we'll get to that in just a little bit, in one more second. Okay, so here, the supply of loanable comes from savings, and on the other end of the spectrum, people demand money. They want to demand money today, which they'd be happy to pay back tomorrow, and those are borrowers. So if I need money to buy a car, I can borrow money. I'm demanding money today to pay off the car in the future. So the demand side of the model is the borrowers. Okay, and like we said, and like I just said, in the savings side, or the supply side, this is going to be households. And this also includes, so this is private savings, and this also includes public savings by the government. So households and the government. On the demand side, the borrowers are what we think of as firms. So if you remember back to the circular flow of money that we had the financial system, and we had savings coming in from households and also from the government. And then we had that money leaving the financial system by firms, and this is for investment purposes. So firms are going to demand money or borrow money so that they can operate their firms in the future. So if they want to buy a new machine, they need money. So if we think just at its basics, if we think of Paul Revere's Pizza or a pizza shop, if their brick oven goes out, it's probably pretty costly to replace that. And Paul Revere's probably just doesn't have the cash on hand to go buy another brick oven. So they'd have to go to a bank to borrow the money to replace the brick oven. Or if they wanted to expand their business, they might need to borrow to buy a new brick oven. So instead of having one, they might need to have two so that they can have a larger operation. And in that case, since they don't have the money to buy the brick oven, they're going to have to borrow it. So we're thinking of firms for investment. Okay, so the borrowers come from firms for investment, and the savings come from households and the government. Okay, so private savings and public savings. So if we think about this market, we want to look at, well, what does supply and demand look like? Okay, so let me erase for you. So down here, we have the quantity, but the quantity of loanable funds is measured in dollars. So this is the dollar amount of loanable funds. I'll call it LF for loanable funds. Okay, so this is how much money is available to be lent out or borrowed. And then we have to think about what is the price of loanable funds. Well, the price of borrowing money is how much I have to pay in interest on it. So if I borrow $1 and I have to pay 10% interest, that means that overall I have to pay 10% for borrowing $1. Okay, so I pay back the dollar, or I borrow the dollar, then I pay it back. That gets me back to zero, but then I have to pay 10 cents on top of it. Okay, so the interest rate is really the price of borrowing money. Or if I'm a saver or a lender, that's the price that I'm receiving for supplying money. Okay, and we're looking at the real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate. If we're looking over short time, however, so if we're looking, let's say 3 months or less, the real interest rate is going to be approximately equal to the nominal interest rate if inflation is very low. Okay, so here we have the price of loanable funds, which is the interest that I receive if I'm a lender, or the interest that I have to pay when I'm a borrower. That's the price. And then we have the quantity, which is the total lending volume. If we think about the supply curve, I'm thinking about what would make me save money. So as a household, if I find out that banks are paying no interest, well, I can just keep the money in my wallet and I'd be just as happy. So if interest rate is very low, I might save very little in the financial system. However, if interest rates are very high, I'm going to supply more. So in that case, let's say that the bank says, hey, if you save your money now, I'll give you 15% for a savings account. Okay, well, 15% is a really good return. So in that case, instead of spending money or holding onto it in my pocket, I would probably be more prone to put it into a checking account or a savings account, which would earn that interest. So for lenders, as the interest rate increases, it becomes more and more appealing to lend money or to save money. Okay, so our supply curve looks exactly like every other supply curve that we've examined, which is an upward sloping supply curve. And we can think about supply is equal to savings, so S is for supply, but S can also stand for savings in this model. And then if we think about borrowing money, so the flip side of that is we can think about student loans or car loans or mortgage payments. Or in this case, we're thinking about investment spending for capital purchases for firms. So if the interest rate is very high, that means it's very costly to borrow money. So for example, if you have student loans and I come to you and I say, hey, would you be interested in taking out student loans? It only costs you 150% interest. You go, well, that's a really high interest rate, and for that high, I wouldn't want to borrow any money because that's a lot that I'm going to have to be paying. Okay. Now on the flip side, if I said, hey, would you like to borrow money for student loans? I'm going to charge you 3% interest. So instead of 150, I lower it down to a very low interest rate, 3%. And in that case, you might be more prone to borrow money. So as the price of borrowing declines, you're going to be borrowing more and more money, or quantity demanded of loanable funds is going to increase. So just like every other demand curve that we've ever seen, the demand curve in the market for loanable funds is downward sloping. Okay, and then overall, just like we've seen in supply and demand models, equilibrium is going to determine how much lending is available, or the equilibrium lending and borrowing amount, and it's also going to determine the equilibrium interest rate, or this is where interest rates come from, is from this market. So here, equilibrium occurs where supply equals demand, or we have market clearance. And that's going to tell us that based on the supply and demand for loanable funds, this is where we get the interest rate from. In this model, it's going to be at R star. And then the demand for loanable funds, I'll just put $ star. So this is the equilibrium quantity of money that flows through the financial system. So in this model, we're going to have $ being saved and also $ being borrowed, because quantity supplied equals quantity demanded at equilibrium. And the equilibrium interest rate that borrowers have to pay or that lenders receive is going to be R star. So this is our basic setup for the market for loanable funds. And again, this determines interest rates and how much money is going through the financial system. Okay, overall, this is going to be equal to total investment, because out of the circular flow of money, we said equilibrium savings equals investment, or savings equals investment, because of the financial system. So this is equal to I, big I, our investment spending, which is, in this case, an equilibrium number. Okay, so overall, we have our supply and demand. Now let's think about factors that would shift supply. So we think factors that shift supply. And in this case, there's basically three. The first one is going to be income and wealth. So if I make more money, so let's say I win the lottery, so I have an increase in wealth, or I get a pay raise, that means that I have more money at my disposal. So for me, I'm going to probably put more money into the bank or more money into the financial system, and that increase in lending is going to increase the supply of loanable funds, because banks can lend more if I'm saving more. Okay, so the first factor, we'll call it factor 1, is going to be income and wealth. Okay, so we have income and wealth, and as income or wealth increases, supply is going to increase. Factor 2 is how fast do I want to consume? Because if I'm saving money, that means that I'm forfeiting consumption today. So if I put money into the bank, that means that I'm not buying a PlayStation 4 today. So if I really want a PlayStation 4 today, I'm not going to save my money, I'm going to spend it instead. So the second one is time preferences. So if I really want a PlayStation 4, instead of saving my money, my time preferences say that I want that PlayStation 4 today instead of in a month. So I'm going to decrease how much I supply in the bank account today, because I'm buying the PlayStation 4 today instead of in a month. Okay, so if time preferences increase, or I increase my preference to consume today as compared to the future, the supply of loanable funds is going to shift to the left. So for the first one, income and wealth, that's a positive relationship. For the second one, time preferences is going to be an inverse relationship. So if I prefer to consume today, or my time preferences increase for consumption today, supply is going to shift to the left. Whereas if income and wealth increase, supply is going to shift to the right or increase as well. So we have a positive relationship and an inverse relationship. And then the last one is going to be government spending. So since the government fits into this model, and in this case, let's say, instead of government spending, let's say government savings. And we'll get to what government savings is in just 1 second. So government savings in this model is going to be increasing. So if the government decides to spend less, that means that it's saving more. So just like if I spend less, I'm going to be saving more, holding all else equal. If the government decides to spend less, it's increasing its savings, and that's going to increase the quantity available for lending. Okay, so overall, these are the three things that would shift supply or savings in our market for loanable funds. On the other hand, we have factors that shift demand. And the factors that shift demand are a little bit more simple. So let me go ahead and erase this, and we'll put demand. And there's two of them. So the factors that shift demand, and in this case it's borrowing. So this is going to determine how much people want to borrow at any given interest rate. And the first one is the productivity of capital. Okay, And what we mean by this is the expected return from buying new equipment. So if Paul Revere's thinks that it can buy a new brick oven, or our pizza place thinks that it can buy a new brick oven, and it's going to increase its profits by 10%, then overall it's very appealing to buy that new brick oven. So the productivity for capital, or that brick oven for our pizza place, is very high. So in that case, our pizza place would really want to borrow the money to get that brick oven. So the demand for loanable funds would shift to the right. So as productivity of capital increases, more and more people want to borrow money. Another example might be a hospital machine that's very expensive, but it takes a drop of blood and it can test for genetic diseases and whether you have other sorts of viruses or bacterial infections. So a new machine that would make hospitals more efficient or increase the productivity in that hospital, hospitals would be very prone to buy that machine. But if they don't have the cash for it, they're going to have to borrow it from the market for loanable funds. So regardless of the interest rate that they'd have to pay, if that productivity increases, they're going to want to borrow more money. The second factor is going to be investor confidence. So if investors are very cautious about the future, so in this case, we're thinking about investors for investment spending, so firms. If Apple thinks that next quarter is going to be very bad, and over the next year, let's say, they believe that they're going to lose market share of their iPhone to Android, as well as in the tablet market. So they're predicting that over the next year or two, that their profitability is going to decrease. Okay, so this is like investor confidence. They're not very confident about the future as compared to where they are today. So if you go up to Apple and say, hey, do you want to build a new headquarters? For them, it probably wouldn't be worth it because they don't have the confidence. Or another case might be, let's say Apple thinks that its iPhone 6 is going to be a huge success, and it's going to make it very, very popular for everyone involved, and so Android users are going to switch over to using the iPhone 6. So in this case, they're very confident about the future. So if they want to build a new headquarter building, or if they want to build a new plant to operate out of, then for them, they're pretty confident about the future that they'll be profitable, or that they can afford to build that new headquarter building. So as confidence increases, we're going to see people borrowing more and more money. Another way to put it, if I'm borrowing money to buy a car, and I'm very uncertain if I'm going to have a job tomorrow, my confidence is very low, I'm probably not going to borrow money to buy a car today. However, if I think that I'm going to be getting a raise tomorrow, I might go and buy that car today by borrowing the money. So as confidence increases, supply or demand will shift. As confidence increases, the demand for loanable funds will increase as well. Okay, let's go over a couple examples, and then we'll see how the government exactly fits into this. Okay, so example one. So now that we have this, we're going to go through a couple problems. Let's erase this. And in example one, we're going to have, let's say that there's an increase in technology. So suppose that there's an increase in technology. Technology increases. What would happen to equilibrium quantity, or equilibrium investment, and equilibrium interest rate? So I want to know what's going to happen to I star and R star in the market for loanable funds. So here we can use our system that we used before. So we have 5 points, and lights went out on me. Hold on a second, let me get that back on. So step one in solving any supply and demand problem is drawing an initial equilibrium. That's in right there. So step one is complete. Step two is we have to determine, does our shock and increased technology affect supply or demand? So you have to think, increase in technology. So let's just say there's a new machine that cuts metal at a faster rate. So new technology. Okay, so in that case, do we think, is it going to affect households or the government? Or is it going to affect firms, which is the demand? Well, for me, if a machine cuts metal at a faster rate, that doesn't really get me to go to the bank to put money into the bank or take money out of the bank. It doesn't affect me. And likewise, it probably won't affect the government. So government and private savings, private and public savings, aren't going to be really affected. So supply isn't going to move with this. However, for firms, if we're thinking about Ford or Chrysler that has to cut metal for their vehicles, this machine is very attractive for them. So they're probably going to want to invest in it or borrow the money to buy it today. So for them, it's going to affect the demand. So as technology increases, it increases productivity of capital. So we're going to see the demand shift. So step 3 is now, is demand going to increase or decrease? So if we have an increase in productivity or an increase in technology, that's going to make buying that new machine very appealing for firms. So they're going to want to buy it at any given price. So that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. Step 4 is, let's graph that. So step 4 is graph an increase in the demand. So demand is going to shift to the right, D prime. Step 5 is find our new equilibrium. So we have R star prime, and this we'll call I star prime. And let me erase this first one. And I'm using I star here because we're thinking about savings equals investment. Here's savings, here's investment. So investment comes from an equilibrium in this model. Okay, so in this case, if we have an increase in technology, we're going to see an increase in investment spending, and the interest rate is going to increase as well. All right, one more model, and then we'll go through how the government fits in specifically. Or let's go through that right now. So let me erase this very quickly. And then we want to find out, how does savings equal investment? So we want to know investment equals savings. So first we have to find out, do we have an equation that tells us what investment is? And if we think about our GDP equation, well, that's GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. In a closed economy, NX is equal to 0. So we have Y equals C plus I plus G. Okay, so that is an equation with I in it. So here, if we solve for I, investment spending is going to be equal to GDP less consumption and government spending. Or rearranging this tells us that Y equals C plus I plus G. Okay, so this is investment. On the savings side, we have two forms of saving. We have private savings and public savings. So savings private, PR for private, is going to be savings by households. Savings by households is going to be equal to total income less that's taken out of my pocket, so net income minus how much I spend on consumption. So total income is going to be equal to GDP. GDP equals income. Okay. However, for me, I don't receive that as income. I have to pay taxes on it. So GDP minus taxes is going to be my net income. This is my take-home paycheck. And then whatever I don't spend today on consumption is going to be savings. So my net income minus how much I spent, and spending by households is consumption spending. So this is net income less how much I've spent on consumption, tells me how much I have left over. And that's private savings. Public savings, or savings PU, is equal to savings by the government. And savings by the government is going to be equal to what's its how much revenue that it takes in, less it's spending. And the revenue that the government takes in is taxes. So this is the revenue that the government takes in. And if it takes, and then it spends some, which is government spending, so T minus G is savings by public savings. And in some cases, this can be public savings if government spending is bigger than tax revenue. So in the US currently, government spending is higher than taxes. So this is actually a negative, or the government is a net dissaver overall. Okay, so we have our two forms of savings. And to find total savings, it's going to be equal to private savings plus public savings. So savings total, our big S, is going to be equal to savings private, which is Y minus T minus G. Then we have to add in public savings, so plus T minus G. So this right here is savings private. And these two things are public savings. Now I can go through and I can simplify this a little bit. I see that I have a plus T and a minus T, so the T's cancel out. So that tells me that total savings, let me just write it over here, total savings equals, those two things cancel out. Oh, and this was actually a C, not a G, sorry. So I have total savings is equal to Y minus C minus G. So we have savings, which is Y minus C minus G, and we have investment spending, which is Y minus C minus G. So in equilibrium, investment equals savings, and that comes from the market of loanable funds. So now let's think about how does the government fit into this model. Okay, so the government isn't in borrowing, it's a saver overall. So if savings, if let's say the government increases its spending, holding taxes constant. So this is going to be constant, but this increases. So public savings would go down. So if the government is running a budget deficit, where taxes are less than government spending, public savings is negative. If the government is running a budget surplus, which means that its revenues exceed its spending, our taxes are bigger than government spending, this is going to be positive. So if government spending increases, holding taxes constant, that's going to drive public savings down, which is going to decrease total savings. Okay, so let's go over that in our graph. All right, last problem, and that should give us everything that we need for the market for loanable funds. So suppose G goes up, all else equal, so including taxes equal. So if government spending goes up in the market for loanable funds, we have our initial equilibrium, which is step one. So we have supply and demand. This tells us equilibrium interest rate, equilibrium private investment spending, government spending goes up. We know that government comes into the form of savings. So public savings goes down, which means total savings goes down, which means that our supply curve is going to decrease. So government fits into supply, step two. Step three is that if this goes up, savings goes down, our supply decreases or shifts to the left. So step three is supply is shifting to the left. Step four is graphing that. So we graph a leftward shift in supply. And step five is finding our new equilibrium, R star prime, I star prime. So as government spending increases, we see the equilibrium interest rate increase and private investment spending in the economy decrease. Okay, this connection that government spending increases causes the equilibrium interest rate to increase, which causes investment spending to decrease. We call that crowding out. Or government spending crowds out private investment spending. We think in the short term. So overall, if government spending increases, it crowds out some private investment spending. Okay. Overall, our increase in government spending decreased savings, which increased interest rates, which made investment spending less attractive because it became more expensive to borrow. Okay, so overall, we call that effect crowding out, and government fits into this model into supply. So those are just a few examples of how the market for loanable funds works, and it tells us how interest rates are going to move depending on how things move in the economy. Thanks.